Welcome to session 3 of the topic on the idea of progress and the formation of modern America. So we're continuing this topic, and we're going to cover the remaining portions, the remaining segments of the ideas of progress that I introduced in the first session, and that we started elaborating on the second session, and that is we're really looking at the 19th century as a century in which the idea of progress became the dominant idea or the dominant mode of thought, in that this was the way that the people living in this century, particularly in the latter part of the 19th century, this is the way people began to think about human societies, what human existence was all about, what was the purpose of human beings living on Earth, for example, and how people needed to actually organize themselves economically to achieve human happiness, and also they began to think about the world around them, the world of nature, and also saw that in almost every aspect of life, whether we're talking about human beings as individuals or human societies, or even in the world of nature, they saw that progress was occurring everywhere. Okay, so this was the dominant idea, the dominant mode of thought of the 19th century, in that people really were convinced during this time, and of course this is going to continue into the 20th century, but people in the 19th century were convinced that that was the meaning of existence itself, that everything was progressing, that there was a purpose embedded in the fabric of creation. There was a purpose for human beings to be placed on the earth, and so on, and that is to better ourselves, to improve the way we live, the way we think, what we know of ourselves and what we know of the world, and to really reach a higher and higher plane of existence, material plane in this case, because as we started elaborating on session 2, what is going on here is that there's of course a scientific model introduced in the Western world, particularly in places like Europe and North America, that is bringing the age of materialism. Okay, this new science is really concentrating on the material aspect of reality and leaving out the spiritual, and of course suggesting that reality is material and that's all we can actually know and study. So we're talking about a material plane again of existence, that people were thinking of progress in material terms. That is to say that we're actually bettering ourselves and reaching different stages of growth and development until we're going to reach an ideal material existence, in other words, in the future. How far in the future? Well, nobody knows, but people in the 19th century were convinced that this is where we're heading. Okay, we were heading now to a future that was more advanced. There will be more technology. Our systems of knowledge will be far superior to the ones of the 19th century. And as I indicated in the first and the second session, when we're talking about, of course, science and technology, the expectation was that people believed that this science was going to give humans all of the knowledge of the universe, so human beings will actually be able to master it and control it. So again, this is how people thought in the 19th century of the new developments of the scientific revolution, for example. People believe in scientific progress because the more progress in science, the more we know, the more we're able to solve problems and so on in the world that afflicts human beings. And of course, we also saw the technological revolution. People also in the 19th century believed in technological progress, believing that the more our tools are improved, the more we advance technologically, human beings are going to actually create a society that will be more efficient, more effective, and in that people will actually use that technology to do all of the work for people. In other words, the technology is going to pretty much do everything that human beings did in the past. So humans will be freed to pursue other endeavors, to grow in other areas, again, to develop ourselves, and to live a more comfortable life. Again, so there was also a faith placed in technological progress, not only scientific progress, but technological progress. Now, we're going to, in this session, shift our gears, our attention to another aspect of progress that people were also very convinced of, that was one of the purposes of human existence. In other words, what we're here doing in this earth, besides knowing more, accumulating more knowledge, and in improving our tools, what we call technology, what we're doing here also is trying to create a society in which we're going to organize ourselves. We're going to create an economic system. We're going to work together. We're going to organize ourselves for the purpose of creating this ideal society, this ideal existence in which everybody is going to better their economic condition and economic well-being. In other words, to create prosperity, what we will just call economic prosperity, if you will. So human beings in the 19th century, particularly the latter part of the 19th century, became convinced that this is what we're here to do as human beings, to be prosperous. Because the more prosperity, the more progress that you achieve economically, the better off you're going to be. You're going to take care of your needs, like food, shelter, clothing, all the basic necessities. But beyond that, you are also going to enjoy yourself. You're going to be happy, in other words, in this world. So it's important, again, for the people of the 19th century, for them, it was important to improve their economic well-being, okay, to work towards betterment in terms of trying to create more and more affluence, more prosperity, to improve their economic conditions, because they believe that will deliver happiness. They will achieve this material happiness if they have a better economic condition. So again, this is the second area where the minds of the people living in the Western world, particularly in the United States, are going to be so convinced of, and that is that people thought of progress in terms of economics. And when people thought of progress in terms of economics in the 19th century, they were thinking about an economic system in particularly. And that was the economic system that had come to dominate the developing or the industrialized world in this case. Those nations that were rapidly developing their industries, they were undergoing an industrial revolution, and creating, of course, things like factories and so on, industries, plants, and railroads, etc. They had, of course, done that. They have developed those industries. They have modernized their economies to do a capitalist economic system. That was the model that they used to develop their economies and to pretty much develop a middle class in the process. So it is in this transition again, with the rise of capitalism, that nations were able to industrialize on one hand, but also again transform their societies, in that they created a middle class that was on the rise. So they saw that, well, that is a sign of economic improvement, of course, because more and more people are rising up, in the economic ladder. So when people thought of economic progress, they thought of capitalism in the late 19th century, particularly the late 19th century, because by the late 19th century, capitalism had become the predominant economic system of Western Europe, and also the predominant economic system of North America. Okay, and as we're going to be moving into the 20th century, there will be a host of different countries from around the world that were now trying to catch up with the advanced technologies and industries and economies of Western Europe and North America by moving towards capitalism. So again, people were trying to develop their national economies now by adopting capitalism. Okay, and so this is extremely important, again, that how capitalism in the late 19th century was now, pretty much the dominant, system of the industrialized world. And there were very few in industrialized nations. As I mentioned, Western Europe, we're talking about Great Britain, France, Holland, Germany, and in North America, of course, the United States. And very soon, again, as we move into the 20th century, we're going to see other nations like Japan, for example, also adopting the capitalist system, and other nations trying to rapidly modernize as well and catch up with the modern nations of the West, and trying to create the same type of benefits, the same type of economic conditions that the West had created, and trying to modernize very rapidly. And those were countries like Russia and China, for example, that were trying to accelerate their development by adopting capitalism. Of course, we're going to see what happened in the 20th century when they attempted to do that very fast. So now it is very important at this point that that we understand the background of capitalism, because it's important. It's important to understand, at least briefly, the kind of development, the origins and development of capitalism, and how that system not only emerged in history, but how that system began to alter the way people lived and the way people organized to produce everything that needed to be produced. So just a quick background. Again, it's not going to take more than a few minutes, but so we can understand, again, what is the significance of capitalism and how and why people saw in capitalism a system that organized societies towards progress, that is to say. Okay, it's very important. Why is it that people saw in capitalism a system that will nurture or foster progress in the populations of nations, for example? So one thing to keep in mind is that capitalism is a system that had flourished very recently. I mean, if you're living in the 19th century, capitalism had just flourished about a century or 2 centuries in the past. I mean, it is understood by historians that capitalism as such, as a system that was really used by nations to develop their economies, did not really emerge fully in its mature phase until the 1700s. So again, capitalism has been around only for, a couple of, like 3 centuries from our perspective, about 3 centuries or so. So from the 19th century perspective, it had been around, pretty much like 2 centuries or so on the scene. And this is a system that replaced feudalism. This was the economic system that preceded capitalism. Okay, so under feudalism, this is the system that Europeans lived under for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, going back to the times of the Romans, perhaps a few centuries after the Roman Empire collapsed. We're going to see the rise of feudalism in Europe, and it existed virtually in different forms, in different aspects, if you will, in different degrees, all over the world. So this is the system that governed the economic destinies of human societies before capitalism, and virtually, like I said, This is the system that most people around the world lived in. No, not all of them, but the vast majority of the people of the globe lived under one form or other of a feudal system, uh, or another. I mean, there was just different manifestations of feudalism. So, what was feudalism? So again, under feudalism, it's a very simple, economic system in which um, the economy is organized in a way that there's only two social groups, okay, or social classes, if you will, involved in the system. Okay, so the two social classes are, on one hand, the landlords or the landowners, and they can be, chiefs, they can be monarchs or kings or queens, or a group of nobility members of the nobility, some landlords, if you will. So they pretty much own the land. If you live in a kingdom, it is the king that actually owns all of the land and shares, if you will, the land, gives land grants, if you will, to certain landlords, and they all form part of the, again, land owning class. So that's one, again, class of people. And the other class is the commoners, the rest of the population. Pretty much everybody else are considered to be commoners under feudalism. So that includes pretty much every type of, grouping you can think of, from peasants to artisans and merchants, herders, and so on. All of them constitute the commoners, and they all live in the land of the king or the land of the nobility, if you will, some landowner and so on, so that is member of the nobility. They all live inside of the land that is owned by the owning class. So the way this works is that commoners simply produce products for their own sustenance. Farmers grow their own food. Artisans produce artwork and sell it, and so on and so forth. Merchants carry out some commercial activities and sell, products and so on. And what they have to do is simply pay a share of their product to the landowner as a form of tax. So again, people are simply going about their own daily lives, producing what they need to produce for them to subsist, but they need to pay a share of that, a certain percentage of the product, to the landowner every month, or at the end of the year, or at the end of one season, etc. It doesn't matter. But they're doing that as a form of payment for protection. So again, there is an agreement that the landowner is the Lord Protector of the people. So he is, in this case, there was, of course, situations that were in Europe, of course, female also landowners as well, but for the most part, again, this is a pretty much, in Europe, for example, a male-dominated world. So again, the landowner will simply be responsible for the people in terms of protecting them, in times of crises, whenever there's, for example, raidings taking place, an invasion, or pirates, etc. Again, thieves and robbers, again, that will raid the community. The nobility will have to go and pretty much protect people. And so people will have to pay for that protection. Okay, so how do you pay? Well, you pay a certain tribute or certain tax, a share of the product. And so again, this was a very simplistic, economic system in which there was only landowners and commoners, and this is how people were doing their own business and going about their own daily lives. So again, there was no middle class per se. There was no middle class because there was only commoners on one hand, and of course the landowners on top. But this is going to change again. We're going to see the transition towards capitalism again and how feudalism is going to be phasing out gradually, very slowly but surely. We're going to see the rise of capitalism and replacing feudalism around the 1300s, from the 1300s to the 1700s. So this was the first sign of so-called progress, because now by the 1300s we see that the Europeans are stepping out of the European continent and pretty much, going in different directions in order to connect with outside merchants, in order to engage in commercial exchange. So this is the rise of international trade, the long distance trading networks, again, going to places like the Middle East, India, China, for spices, for silks, for teas, and so on. And the Europeans are commercializing them with those products in Europe. They're also reaching places like Africa, and eventually they're going to discover America in 1492, and of course come to America in order to use the Americas for the production of cash crops, agricultural commodities like sugar, for example, tobacco, coffee, cotton, so on, and be able to export it around the world. So this is the a new time, a new era. There's a commercial revolution taking place that involves, again, long distance trade, land based trade, but also ocean going trade as well, taking place, for several centuries, from the 13th to the 1700s. And this really created a new class of people in Europe, the merchant class. We got, of course, things like trade, of course, taking place, people participating in trade. Merchants are moving into, trade, and they're investing in trading ventures and expeditions to bring goods from faraway lands. In many cases, a group of merchants create companies, associations, they bring investments and pretty much merge those investments and create what was called a joint stock company. This is the forerunner of the modern day company, just in general. Several people, putting capital or investment and creating, of course, companies and so on for the purpose of, conducting international trade. Others investing in things like shipping industries, or transportation, pretty much industries, transporting goods and charging for that, of course. And others are investing in things like commercial agriculture. They're beginning to use the land to grow crops that are worth gold or silver. Okay, so instead of just growing food to sustain their families, some merchants buy land in order to grow cash crops, crops that are actually worth cash. Again, so they want to actually produce something for the market. They want to transform the practice of agriculture and make it into an enterprise, that is to say. So this is changing. This is changing Europe, and for those 4 centuries or so, from the 13th to the 1700s, what we see is the rise of the merchant class. The rise of the merchant class. The merchant class can be seen as the forerunner of the middle class. So this was one of the very early stages for the rise of capitalism in history. It's still not called capitalism by any means, okay? During those centuries, nobody's using the word capitalism to describe what is going on around them. This commercialization of the economy, that there's a market and people are trying to, supply the demands of the products, and they're trying to go into other lands, other continents to bring goods. This international trade, nobody's really calling it capitalism, but it's creating pretty much the institutions, is creating the conditions for the rise of capitalism. It's creating, again, companies and industries and, enterprises that over time, by the 1700s, there's now going to be, of course, a system that will be identified as capitalism, and that nations are going to simply adopt in order to create, of course, the kind of changes that have been going on for centuries, particularly changes in terms of a commercial economy. They want an economy based, for example, on the production of products for exports, for example. They want the creation of businesses or enterprises, and the people are moving now in this direction. Okay, away from feudalism, away from those relationships between the landowner and the commoner, in which the commoner was simply paying for his or her protection with a certain share of the product that he or she produced. So again, feudalism is phasing out because a new system is replacing it. A new system of commercial relations, of course, in which people are trying to produce for the market, not just to sustain yourself, not just to live your life, in kind of in the traditional way and just pay the landlord what needed to be paid so the landlord can protect you, but rather people are moving into business now. They want to generate wealth. They want their generation of wealth, of course, and that is very important for the rise, the historical emergence of capitalism. Again, we got a new class on the rise, the merchant class, that in the 1700s will be instrumental for bringing about capitalism as we know it. So by the 1700s, capitalism is now fully on the rise. All right, so let's talk about then this very important transformation, the rise of capitalism in the 1700s, and we'll see how by the 19th century, by the 1800s, this is going to be the system of the industrialized nations, those that are going through massive industrialization. And that's exactly what happens in this very important phase of the rise of capitalism, in that in the 1700s there is an industrial revolution, taking place in places like England, for example. England is going through this massive industrialization process, and in this transition towards industrialization, the rise of industries and factories and steel plants and so on, it adopts capitalism as the system that is going to guide the economy of England. Okay, so then the question is, so what is it? What is called industrial capitalism? How can we identify it? Why capitalism is different from any other system that we know of? For example, how is capitalism different from feudalism or any other system of today? Well, by the 1700s, what we see is that in England there were specific reforms that the merchant class pushed for, okay? And they have been pushing those reforms ever since the 1600s, okay? And one of those reforms is the introduction of new laws in England that will protect the property of the merchant class, okay? So because the merchants, of course, in the 1600s had risen to prominence so much in terms of their commercial activities, their enterprises, that they had created, the shipping, of course, some of their shipping industries they had bought land and so on, used the land for distribution centers, for storage and so on of products. But that property was not recognized as theirs per se. Okay, because under the old feudal system, all of the land of England belonged to the king. So he was the supreme property owner, that is to say, and the king could just simply take away the land from anybody, if that was his decision, for any reason, that is to say. So, and that, of course, that happened in England in the 1640s. 1630s, 1640s, the English king began to seize property from the merchants, from the English merchants at will. And there's going to be, of course, an uprising against the king. It's called the English Civil War. And, of course, the merchants waged war against the king because he was violating the private property. Of course, merchants believed that all of that land that the king was seizing and the assets and so on, their businesses were theirs, that they were the ones that actually worked for. And so they or asking for some form of honoring of those, again, assets and property. So they were, again, very insistent in pushing for certain legal reforms, in which what they wanted is new laws in England in which the private possessions, the private property of individuals will be honored and respected as theirs, as opposed to, oh, this is just, the old feudal system in which the king is the owner of the land and he can just seize it. So the merchants don't want to continue with this old feudal system. They want to put an end to that, and instead they want a system in which, again, people are given the right to property, property rights, that is to say. So this is the first step towards capitalism. Capitalism, one of the seed ideas, if you will, or principles, is the idea of private property, that under a capitalist system, individuals are allowed to own property. And that includes anything. You can buy, a piece of land, you can buy resources like a forest, you can purchase a lake, you can purchase a river, you can purchase virtually anything, again, from nature, if you have the capital, that is to say. And so human beings can own parts of nature, okay, whether natural resources or land, etc. And the idea is not just to own it for the sake of owning it. Okay, under capitalism, there's a purpose why people should own property, and this, of course, was something that came out of the English reforms. And the idea is that you want to use that property to generate wealth. Okay, it's not just that you just want to use that property just to leave it there unproductive. You want to make it productive. You want to create it create wealth from it, that is to say. You want to build wealth from it, turn it into an enterprise. So the idea is you create private property, you create laws to protect private property in order to bring about called free enterprise. So if you have the desire to open up a business, there it is. You have the right to open up a business. Along, of course, it's a legal, of course, business, of course. But the idea is, how can you create a business that is yours if you're not allowed to own property? Well, now there is that. Again, in England, you're given the right to own property, of course, to create free enterprise. And with that, of course, we're going to see the flourishing in England and later on in the United States of free enterprise. Again, host hundreds and hundreds of different shops and businesses and industries, factories that are on the rise, that are privately owned. They're owned by private citizens, by individuals, that is to say. They're operating those businesses on their own. So this is another feature, again, of capitalism, again, that is on the rise in the 1700s. And of course, another important characteristic of capitalism that capitalism actually brought to humanity is the idea of wage labor. And that is that you can also create wealth by selling your labor for a wage, that is to say. If you don't have capital to buy land, if you don't have capital to open up a business, well, you have capital. The idea is that individuals have one form of capital that is labor. You can actually go and, work for an employer, for one of the enterprises and factories and industries that are on the rise, and you can be employed there permanently for a wage. So at the end of the week or at the end of the month, the employer will pay you for your work. So this is all something new that did not exist under feudalism. Under feudalism, people did not work for a wage. There was no wage labor. People simply worked the land, went about their daily activities, whatever it was, and pretty much paid a share of that product to the landowner for protection. But the idea that people were simply going to a place and be working there for a wage, that is just didn't exist. So what that actually created, the revolution of capitalism is called the capitalist revolution, again, that it begins in the 1700s is the idea that with the introduction of private property, free enterprise, and wage labor, we're going to see now a system in which provided people to move in the social ladder. So instead of being born, for example, a farmer, and that was your destiny, because by tradition, if you're born in under feudalism, if you're born a farmer, you'll stay a farmer all your life. That under capitalism, the idea is that, well, you don't have to, you don't need to stay there if you don't want to. So the idea is that you can move, from that position upward. There's mobility, social mobility. You can work, you can maybe save money and use that money to go to school, for example, train yourself, educate yourself, and trying to better yourself, and trying to maybe later on try to work for an employer that will pay you more. Because that was the idea under capitalism, is that yes, there's wage labor, but you're getting paid for your labor according to your skills, according to your knowledge. So the more you know, the more skills you acquire through training and education and so on, the employer will pay you more. So there was an incentive for people to move upward in the ladder by trying to better themselves and trying to acquire more and more skills, more knowledge, educating themselves and so on, earning degrees, etc., and trying to move upward in the ladder and rising above, of course, the original station of life that from which you came. Doesn't matter. That there was an opportunity to move upward, that is to say, it's called social mobility, of course, and with that we're going to see the formation of social classes. Okay, capitalism brought also a new society, a society divided into different social classes. We're going to see the working class, the middle class, and the upper class, of course. And under capitalism, at least in theory, the idea is that, well, people can actually just move up and down the ladder according to their discipline and according to their aspirations and luck, perhaps, I don't know, merit, so on. And they can actually move up and down the ladder. Okay, so that was something different from the system of the past, from the system that governed human societies in the past called feudalism. Now we got a new system. Okay, people can own property, they can open up their own business, and they can actually earn their livelihood by the payment of wages. And if they improve their skills and their knowledge, they can actually earn more and perhaps become part of the middle class in the process, attain middle class status and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is something very, very different from the way people actually carried out economic activities in the past again. And what's significant here is that the nations that are adopting capitalism, like England and then later on the United States came second, if you will, in the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s. The United States is moving towards industrial capitalism as well. It's creating, of course, the same type of changes that England created back in the 1700s, and it created them first in the northern states before the Civil War, but after the Civil War, that system of capitalism is going to also transform the way of life of the southern states and move pretty much across the entire territory. It will become a fully industrial capitalist economy. The United States by the late 19th century, without a doubt, with all the features I just discussed, just a moment ago. So by the late 19th century, of course, what we see is that there was a handful of countries that had created those changes. The Western European countries I mentioned, and the United States, and Japan was also moving into that direction. This Asian nation of Japan was also moving towards a capitalist economy, industrial capitalism, by the late 19th century, early 20th century, very rapidly. So what I actually want to discuss here in terms of the idea of progress is that obviously by the late 19th century, people saw in capitalism the system that had created progress. Again, this is the perception of the people living in those times, that you look back, they say, well, wait a minute, look at all of the changes that had transpired, in the recent centuries, with the rise of the merchant class, for example, with international trade back in the 13, 14, 15, and 1600s, the rise of businesses, commercial agriculture, etc., international trade, and so on. Great changes. A new class is on the rise, and that class made it possible to actually introduce industrial capitalism in the 1700s, with private property, free enterprise, wage labor, social classes. So people saw that this was the system that will allow for nations to develop their economies, that nations that wanted to become wealthy, in other words, nations that wanted to create wealth, to create a large middle class, a middle class composed of shopkeepers, business owners, industrialists in many cases, of perhaps small-scale, middle-sized industrialist manufacturers, for example, a class of trained professionals, for example, working and managing the industries and the companies and centers of learning, universities and so on. If you wanted to create that, the expectation is, well, you need to do that through capitalism, in other words. The vast majority of the nations around the world are still feudal, okay, in their systems. Okay, it is only just those countries I mentioned that had adopted capitalism and abandoned feudalism. But the reality is that all around the world, people are still living under some form of feudal system in which there's a large peasantry in those countries, working the land and paying tribute to landowners, paying tribute to chiefs, paying tribute to kings, for example. And that's pretty much, the reality of most countries. They have not yet industrialized. They don't have anything like private property of any kind. So there's still, the vast majority of the countries around the world are still in this condition. So at any rate, so that was the expectation. The expectation is, if you want to achieve economic development, capitalism is, again, the system, of course, that needs to be adopted. And of course, there's going to be an invitation, of course, to the nations of the world that this is the way you modernize your economy. This is the way you industrialize. This is the way you catch up with the industrialized world. In other words, you have to, adopt a capitalist system. And in this process, of course, you're going to receive the benefits of an industrial society, a modern society. With the capitalism is going to allow for all the generation of wealth and so on that comes with it. Now, at this point, what I actually want to discuss is how people during this time understood capitalism. In other words, when people suggested that, oh, this is the system that will allow progress, this is the system that will change the nations of the world and turn them into very wealthy, nations and so on. And people will be happy in the process, of course. So now I want to get to the core ideas as to how people interpret capitalism here at home in the US, but also abroad. Okay, so this is extremely important. How people interpret it, capitalism. Great. So back in the late 19th century, capitalism was not necessarily referred as capitalism during those times, even though there was the term already coined, already being, and there was in use, by certain intellectuals and philosophers and so on, in academics. But on a popular level, the term that people use to describe what today we know as capitalism was economic liberalism, or laissez-faire. Laissez-faire economics or economic liberalism were the same terms that people used back in the 19th century to refer to capitalism. Because during this time, what people refer to as capitalism, for example, economic liberalism, some of the central ideas, again, that capitalism introduced to human societies, and that is really, really the basis, if you will, the fundamental idea that sustains, the capitalist societies and capitalist systems, is number one, the idea of individualism. Okay, I'll tie it up right now. I'll link it to what is economic liberalism. Again, it's really deeply connected with this idea of individualism. Capitalism introduced the idea of individualism, that the individual is the most important in society. Okay, and it introduced the idea that individuals all are different from one another. There are no two individuals that are exactly the same. So we have different ways of thinking, we have different needs, different desires, different wants, different ways of interpreting happiness. So if we are so different, so therefore the individual has to be set free in the world to pursue their own. Individuals have to be set free in the world to pursue their own happiness. That is to say, that's called economic liberalism. In other words, this is an economic system that sets people free to pursue their own self-interest in the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so everybody is going to go out there and try to work towards their own individual happiness, in other words. So every individual is responsible, therefore, for their own economic well-being and your own economic happiness, in other words. So every individual has to work at it every single day. It has to be disciplined, it has to be motivated, it must have aspirations. An individual has to wake up in the morning very early and try to, work towards the goal of trying to better, his or her situation, etc., in terms of trying to improve their way of life, trying to educate themselves, and trying to go, work, save money, and so on. Be diligent, again, in your pursuit to better yourself. And that no one is responsible for your own, well-being. That at the end of your life, you cannot turn back and say, I'm actually poor because, my parents were responsible for that. Okay? Blaming others, like family members that were holding you back, or that, that didn't let you do such and such, or didn't let you study this or that. That no, you cannot blame anybody, because you are making individual choices every single day as to how you want to live. Okay, so this is what capitalism proposes. I'm just referring to what capitalism says, by the way. So again, it's the idea of individualism, again, is central to the thinking, to this economic philosophy, and that so all responsibility, therefore, is placed on the individual. Individuals are responsible for their station in life, whether they're staying in the same place or they're rising in the economic ladder, etc. That they're responsible. Okay? So people have to be pretty much making decisions and discipline themselves and pretty much focusing on the goal of trying to improve themselves, and not really, following what other people think or doing what other people are saying, etc., but rather just following your own path to happiness, in other words. It's a very individualistic type of system. So the reason why this is important, I want to actually just clarify this. The reason why this is important is because, when capitalism began to pretty much flourish and try to enter into different areas of the globe, other societies were not welcoming with open arms, again, capitalism, because it was very individualistic. And when you look at human societies worldwide, a vast amount, again, of people are not living in societies that are individualistic. Okay? In other words, the individual is important, but the community is more important. Okay, the community. People work in communities. They work in groups in places like Asia. When you look at Asian societies, for example, all over Asia, in places, particularly in places like China, in places like Southeast Asia, for example, in places like Korea, Vietnam, for example, all those places, there is a community based of social organization. The societies are based on communities, and the individual, even though it's important, it is more important the community, that the community has to succeed, the community has to thrive and survive, and individuals must work together as groups and not as individuals in order to make the community work. Okay, that holds true of indigenous peoples here in America. There's a lot of indigenous societies, traditional societies in the American continent that work under that system. In Africa, okay, there's a vast numbers of people that work as communities. It's called community enterprise. So again, there's going to be all over the world a sense that even though there were certain benefits associated with capitalism, ultimately they said, well, yeah, but this is going to make people very individualistic. In that, instead of people working, for the community, with the community, they're going to break away from the community. They're going to start, making their own minds and thinking about what they want, their own pursuits, their own self-interest as opposed to the interest of the community. And again, so see that there's going to be some form of tension between this system, again, that is highly individualistic from the systems of other societies around the world, that they do work together, whether it's fishing, whether it's hunting, whether it's farming, or building a home. When people build homes in those communities, there's members of the community that come and help you build the home in this case. So this is extremely important. How in other societies, again, people are not going to necessarily welcome this individualistic aspect of capitalism, and in certain sense reject it. Okay, is extremely important. The idea of private property and free enterprise is also critical and central to the capitalist philosophy. The idea that you can own property in order to create enterprise, to generate wealth. Now, this concept was also introduced in other areas of the world. It was welcomed by some as, well, yeah, you have to allow people to own property. Okay, you have to end the feudal system of the past in which the chief is the only one that could own the property, or the king, etc. But what happens is that in other societies, the property was held in common with other members of the community. It's called communal land holdings. So an entire community will own the land and will have access to the land. So what happens when you introduce private property in those types of systems, in which you say, you know what, this system in which all of the community owns the resources might not be the best idea to create progress here. You might want to rethink this and allow individuals instead to own the land. Individuals. So again, that also created some tensions with some particular communities, because particularly indigenous communities in America, for example, because what that did is that some individuals will own more land than others and will end up depriving the members of the other community from vital resources like water, for example. So what happens if somebody comes along and buys that river? Everybody has been using the river. Everybody has entitlements to use the water of that river for many, many generations in the past. But now that river is private property. It belongs to this individual. And this individual is now charging money, for example, to access that resource. So there's going to be, conflict again with other societies, in that there's, this idea of private property, even though it was welcome, it also created a sense of exclusion for certain communities that had functioned under this communal form of organization, communal land holdings, for example. Okay. So again, ultimately, what capitalism, of course, is promising to the nations that want to develop, that want to transform their societies and create progress, is that ultimately, if you create an individualistic society, you set individuals free in economy to pursue their own self-interest, and if you introduce private property for the creation of free enterprise, the ultimate goal, in other words, where we're heading, is that we're going to create a large middle class. This is the ultimate goal of capitalism. The ultimate promise is, through capitalism, you can create a gigantic middle class that most members of the middle class will live happy through the consumption of goods. A consumer paradise, that is to say. That members of the middle class are not just going to be earning money to pay for basic expenses like food, shelter, clothing, etc., but rather that the middle class is going to use their leisure time in order to enjoy themselves in this world. And how they're going to enjoy themselves? Through the consumption of goods and services, consumption or consumerism, if you will. It's a material source of happiness, if you will. So we're going to see, of course, with capitalism entering the 20th century, the rise of a consumer culture. This is the vision of the future, again, for capitalist societies, is that they want to create so much affluence, prosperity, that they want to turn everybody as much as possible into members of the middle class. And in this process, of course, build a consumer paradise again. So economic progress was perceived to be a kind of system, a kind of condition capitalism will create, in that people will experience life on earth as an earthly paradise, okay? An earthly paradise, that is to say. Now, of course, there were competing visions of progress, okay? That is to say, capitalism is not going to be just the system that is trying to develop economies on a national level in different parts of the world and transforming those economies in the process, and those societies, transforming those societies in the process, but capitalism is also going to have some form of competition, okay? Competition, that is to say. And what is that competition? Is that there will be alternative or competing visions of progress that are going to also propose alternative paths to development. We can actually develop an economy in a different way that does not necessarily follow strictly the principles of a capitalist economy. That is to say, of rigid, individualism, for example, and private property and competition and so on and so forth. But in Europe, particularly in Europe, we're talking about Europe now, and some European societies are going to develop alternative ways of thinking that they believe were going to create this ideal existence in the future. What kind of economic system will create an ideal existence, an ideal society? So this is, again, in this case, we're talking about the rise of socialism, for example. Okay, in the 19th century, we're going to see the rise of socialism in Europe, in that this economic system that is going to compete with capitalism is going to take, of course, most of the aspects of capitalism and leave a great many of them, but modify it. Okay, and instead of seeing a system in which individuals are simply competing for resources, competing in the economy for jobs, for example, and that individuals are simply solely responsible for their own economic well-being. Under socialism, again, we're going to see that the socialists believe that not all individuals competed on the same level, that not all individuals had the same strength, the same stamina, the same health, for example, the same conditions to compete with everybody else, and some individuals will simply fall behind, and those, of course, in Europe, of course, the situation like poverty, for example, what to do with the poor, for example. Or the unemployed, there's massive unemployment. Okay, so you got unemployment as well. So what about those people? There's people that cannot work because they're too old. They cannot compete. They just don't have the energy or the stamina. What about the elderly, for example? What about children that are orphans? They were abandoned since very, very early age. They're orphans, sometimes living in the streets, etc. So what about that? So what the socialists believe is that the state can indeed intervene in the economy to lessen the effects of an economy that is too based on competition, too individualistic, that is to say. So instead of just focusing on the individual and only in the individual, what the socialist is that, well, maybe we need to just focus on society at large. Makes sure that all of the society, pretty much participate in progress, that receive some benefits of progress. Okay? So instead of abandoning, for example, the poor to their fate, well, you maybe want to create programs to give them jobs, for example, or to educate them, etc. Try to, in other words, lift them up somehow. The state creating some form of assistance or programs for the elderly, for example, taking care of the elderly so they don't, they're not also abandoned or left behind. And unemployment, once again, when there's massive unemployment, you can address the problem of unemployment, giving people some jobs, etc., so they can have a means of subsistence and so on. So you create what is called welfare. But it's not just giving people money, it's just trying to, create a society in which you just don't leave people, on the sides of the road, but rather trying to lift them up and trying to integrate them in the whole of society, in other words. And of course, there was an alternative or competing vision of progress known as communism. And in this system, of course, people simply said, well, if you really want to do away with all competition and etc., and problems in the economy like poverty, well, just abolish private property. Nobody will own property, and it's a classless society. So there's no social classes, in other words. Okay, so again, this is yet another type of system that will compete with capitalism in the 20th century. We're going to see that once we move into the 20th century, there's going to be an intense competition between capitalism and communism on the world stage. And of course, this is going to divide human societies and nations around the world, as we'll see. Let me just check the time. Okay, so we still have about 20 minutes. I think it's going to be enough for covering this last portion. All right, so once again, in terms of the economic progress, think of it as by the late 19th century, people saw for example, in the United States, in capitalism, a system that was creating change, and that had been creating change for quite a while. And with the rise of a middle class and with the rise of enterprises and business, they saw that all of that was really creating a new society in which people had at least the opportunity to improve themselves. They could own property if they wanted to. They can open up a business if they wanted to. Or they can work for a wage in different places and pretty much move upward in that place by working hard or maybe going to school at night and trying to better themselves and so on and so forth. So people by the late 19th century believed that this was something that was occurring not only in the United States, but inevitably that this was going to occur all over the world. But as I mentioned, there was going to be competition in the 20th century between different ideologies. Capitalism is not going to be alone trying to transform the nations of the world and trying to say this is the system that is going to allow people to grow economically, but there were other systems that were also proposing alternative viewpoints in the process. All right, so Now, there's one last idea I want to talk about here that people in the late 19th century came to learn about and had a profound impact in the way they thought about progress and the way they also thought about how to organize human societies to attain progress. And that is the idea of evolution. This is a scientific idea. Again, this is an idea proposed by science that indicated that, in a nutshell, if you want to use just very simple concepts, very simple terms, what science was saying is that with this idea of evolution, is that progress was occurring not only within human societies in the way people were understanding the universe or their tools or their economies, but that progress was occurring even in the world of nature, in the universe. That progress was one of the principles of nature, one of the laws of nature, is that even nature is moving forward and has been moving forward for quite a while, improving the organisms, the living organisms, everything that is alive in nature, everything that is alive, that is called life, whether we're talking about a cell or a molecule or any simple organism like, say, for example, even amoebas, even worms, for example, or plants, animals, all the way to human beings, that we have been progressing all along. And in fact, this has been going on ever since the beginning of life itself. Okay? So we're moving to a higher and higher plane, a higher order of being, in that the future, we're going to be more perfect, we're going to be more fit. Our organisms are going to be more complex than the ones of today, and the ones of today are far more fit and complex and strong than the organisms of the past. So, in other words, what evolution suggests is that there's a pattern, and that as time and history moves forward, nature is actually improving over time. This doesn't matter what we do as human beings, nature is actually doing it, in other words. Okay, so it's not just that we are improving as human beings. What we just discussed in the session 1 and session 2, and in this session of economics and science and technology, it's not just that everything that is alive is also doing that. Everything in nature is improving as well. It's one of the laws of nature, in other words. So science, through this idea of evolution, proposed that life progresses again, that this is a law in nature. Progress occurs in nature, in other words. Okay? So by saying that, of course, what science was doing simultaneously is that it was questioning the way people understood actually life and the origin of life in general. Okay? Because around, even still, when this theory of evolution was first proposed in 1858, the vast majority, okay, if not all, okay, I don't want to say all because there's going to be, of course, people that think, of course, in different ways, but the vast majority of the population of the Christian world, whether we're talking about Europe or North America, or even of course, in Latin America, of course, where there's, of course, Christianity is the dominant religion. Most people believe that the world was not that old, because the way people understood the origin of the world was through the Bible. So it was through the Bible that people understood how the world was created. Of course, they use the understanding of religion as a principle of creation, in that there's going to be, of course, a supreme being, a creator that created the universe, created the world, created the animals, created the plants, the clouds, the sky, the stars, and it created human beings. The story of Adam and Eve, okay, that is so important in the biblical story. And also People believe that the world was not that old, that it was just about 6,000 years old. Because what the Bible indicates is that if you study the Bible, the history, if you go back in all of the events of the Bible, going back in time to the very beginning, the Bible pretty much indicates that the world was created 6,000 years ago, and according to some scholars of that age, European scholars in the 19th century, the world was created according to them on the year 4004 BC. And they said it was happening around October 26th again. That was the original official date of creation, that people believed that that was the case again. But most importantly, people during this time believed that the world that God created was exactly the world that we see today in terms of the life forms. Okay, all of the living organisms, the plants, the trees, the animals, human beings. This is the way we were created in the beginning of time. When you see an elephant, that is exactly the same species of animal that God created. Nothing has changed. When you see wolves, when you see birds of various kinds, you see that this was a fixed design. It's fixed. In other words, God created everything, was perfect, created the birds and the animals of the earth and human beings and everything, the plants, etc. And this is the way God created those organisms. So nothing had really changed about them. They have pretty much stayed the same across those 6,000 years. So again, science is going to challenge that assumption because there will be new revelations, of course. New revelations, particularly in the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s, that made people realize that maybe what we know about history, what we assume about history, maybe is not that accurate. In other words, that maybe the Earth is not 6,000 years old, might be older than that. So instead of thousands of years, people are going to be thinking now about the possibility of millions of years. And that was mind-boggling, because if you only think that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, and you suddenly come across some evidence that says, no, it's actually, millions of years. It was very, very frightening, again, for a lot of people, because you're learning something new that is pretty much turning your world upside down. You will have to revise everything you thought you knew. You will have to rethink it, in other words, and make sense of it. And in that process, you can experience perhaps a crisis, an existential crisis, if you will, anxiety, if you will. So, new revelations of Earth history. In other words, what was revealed? Okay, so the Industrial Revolution, okay, that was occurring in the 17 and 1800s, was in search for a fuel, the fuel for the steam engines that moved railroads and steamships, and also the smelting of iron ore in the steel plants, coal. It was looking for coal. Okay, it's a fossil fuel that in many cases has to be mined. And as the mining engineers are digging, of course, in the inner layers of the earth, they're going to come across a lot of skeletons, what we call fossils. Okay, fossils are remnants or skeletons of creatures that, when you piece them together, they don't really resemble anything we know of today. When you study, for example, animals, you're like, what kind of animal is this? It's just so different from everything we know. So as the mining engineers are digging deeper and deeper into the inner layers of the earth, they're going to be coming across, once again, past existences of creatures, of organisms. The remnants again are unearthed. In that, again, they're going to ask a lot of questions, and they're also finding out that they're buried in particular layers, that there are layers and layers and layers, that each layer is composed of certain minerals that were formed by perhaps floodings and volcanic eruptions, and that took millions of years to form. And within those layers, you find a certain species of animals, a certain skeleton. But if you continue to dig deeper and deeper beneath that layer, you will find yet another layer composed of different mineral composition, different minerals. That layer was formed also after millions and millions of years worth of history. That were also perhaps other types of floodings, etc., that occur, maybe earthquakes, so on. So what those mining engineers and scientists are finding out is that they're discovering the different eras of the Earth, what you call geological eras. Geological eras are eras that span vast numbers of years, millions and millions of years each, that the Earth went through, and that era, certain creatures roamed the Earth during that particular era. And how do we know that? Is because during that era, those creatures will die and will be trapped again underground, and this is how their skeletons were preserved. So again, this is now revealing the history of the Earth. The history of the Earth is now revealed, and that gives birth to a new branch of science called archaeology. Archaeology, again, is the branch of science that study the past, prehistoric past, the past of thousands and millions of years from now, based on remains like fossils and bones, etc. Again, they're going to be archaeologists. Those scientists are going to be now studying those bones and trying to dig deeper and deeper into the inner layers of the Earth to see farther and farther back in time. That's exactly their purpose. They are trying to discover the past, the hidden past, which is not here on the surface of the Earth, but rather beneath us. This is the history of the Earth, that is to say. Everything is buried. And of course, they're going to be piecing together those skeletons, those fossils, and exhibiting those in museums of science in places like London, for example, in Paris and France. And again, people are going to be visiting them and amused by them. And back in the 19th century, there was no name or term given to them that was official and scientific per se, to say, okay, so we know that this species of animals belong to this and such category, so we don't know. So they would just say, like, okay, is this a giant rodent? Is this a giant rat? It is the skeleton of a giant lizard. What is it? The speculation that those were the skeletons of dragons. Oh, maybe the dragons were real. The European dragons, okay, of the legends of old. Because they looked like them, in a certain sense, but they were not. They were just simply dinosaurs, okay? Those, for us, they're simply different types of dinosaurs, like the T-Rex, for example. So there was an amusement. People were baffled. What are those animals? Like this animal right here. Can you find an animal species in this earth that looks anything close to this one? Okay, so what happened to them? Where are they? How far back they lived? Do we know? What exactly happened to them? But the most shocking of all revelations was the revelations of human bones, of different humans, perhaps even human species or human organisms. We don't know. I mean, there was a lot of speculation that look very different from us as well. Are we connected to them? They look human. That's what they call humanoid, because they look like human. Okay, human-like. That's what a humanoid is, human-like. They look like human, but are they really human? Are we connected to them? Okay, do we have some form of direct link, ancestral connections to those, organisms? What happened to them? Are they around? Did they die? Or did they just change to the way we are today? So what is the answer to that, of course? So people don't know, not yet. There's a lot of speculation, but what people are coming to terms with in the 19th century is that, look, time and history brings change, that nothing stays the same. That when you look around nature, this is not the nature of the past. when you look back in time, when you look at history, there's always change taking place. Not only among humans, in the way we live, in the way we dress, in our art, and our tools, but everything changes. Everything absolutely changes, even in nature. Certain species lived in the past that are no longer around. So what happens? Well, there was change. Okay, certain types of humans lived in the past. They're no longer around. That change, how? We don't know, but change is real. So nothing stays frozen in time. Everything changes. Change is inevitable. Okay, so this is again the beginning stages for the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin, of course, is the British biologist who's credited for introducing a theory to make sense of all those revelations. What happened to those prehistoric creatures? What happened to those giant lizards that today we simply call the dinosaurs? What happened to those human-like organisms, that roam the earth? What happened to them? Okay, did they become extinct and new ones came into being all of a sudden? And if that happened, how that happened? Or did they simply transform themselves into us over time? Okay, so Charles Darwin is going to answer those questions, and again trying to make sense with a theory, again, that explains everything that I just described. All right, so he was a British biologist who lived in the mid 19th century, and he was very, a biologist. He studied life forms, and he visited the museums, and of course he was very, very interested about what happened to those creatures. So he's now on an expedition. He wants to study nature in the raw, to understand and observe. Remember, it's based on observation now. He has to go into the fields. Has to go in nature itself and take notes, make observations. So what he wants to do is go to a spot in which the animals still exist the way they have lived for thousands of years, without the interference of humans. That is to say, he wants to go to a place where there's no human settlement, that humans cannot alter the habitat, the environment of those animals. That is to say, he wants to do that. So he selected a group of islands known as the Galapagos Islands in South America, of the west coast of Peru. So you can see here, this is South America, and there's a series of islands known as the Galapagos Islands. It's a group of islands that are very close by, and there's no human settlement there. People don't go there fish or anything. Again, still very much untouched by the human presence. So he goes there in the 1830s and 1840s. He makes some trips, some expeditions, different points, and he's going to stay there for a while, making, of course, notations. And what he realized is that he discovered, a sort of mechanism that is inbuilt in every living organism through his observations that led to the theory of evolution. So what is that? So this mechanism I'm referring to is the mechanism of adaptation and survival. Okay? Adaptation and survival. That is to say, it is inbuilt in every living organism, whether it's a plant or an animal, humans, etc., to adapt and survive in different types of environments. That is in us. It's an instinct, if you will. Every time we are confronted with a new situation, we move to a new place, etc., we migrate, and we're confronted with a new environmental condition, setting, we try to adapt to that setting. So there's going to be a struggle, if you will, for survival in that setting. It might be adapting to different weather patterns and different soil, different diet, and so on, or challenges in the environment like predators, for example. There might be certain animals that are, predators, and that you have to defend yourself and so on. So that pretty much develop a certain, in that survival, in that adaptation, develops with you certain abilities, certain traits, if you will. So in this adaptation, what Charles Darwin is suggesting here is that in that adaptation, we mutate. It's not just that you just develop certain traits or certain skills, and in that, in sometimes we're forced to mutate to adapt to that environment. We're forced to mutate, that is to say. So our bodies also have the capacity, is inbuilt for mutation, okay, for mutation itself. So our bodies mutate. That is to say, the bodies of animals mutate, the plants, the structures also mutate as they're trying to adapt to different environments and so on and so forth, to challenges in the environment, whether they're weather challenges, whether they're predators, and so on. And so we pretty much develop the mechanisms, whatever is needed in order to adapt to different situations, different environments, and we mutate in the process. Mutation might be gradual, but we change our appearance, we can change our structures, we can change our muscle structures, our bones, we can grow longer legs if we're required to run really fast away from animals. Sometimes again, what happens is that organisms are going to pretty much develop whatever is needed for us to survive, okay, and so on and so forth. And so how he came to that conclusion is because by studying, of course, certain species of birds in the Galapagos Islands, he discovered that there were birds in different islands that looked very similar. It's almost like it's the same species of bird. In other words, they share the common ancestor. But in different islands, that same species of bird developed different features, like longer claws or bigger peaks and so on and so forth, because they were challenged in those particular islands by different predators. So they had to defend themselves. So because only the predators existed in those islands versus the others, the animals that had to adapt and survive in that particular island had to mutate and meet the challenges and develop certain skills, certain features, certain mutations, in other words. So he compared all of those birds and said, this is the same species of animals, but it had mutated. In different islands, every animal pretty much developed different features in order to adapt to the environment. But they all come from a common ancestor. They all come from a same species of bird. So what he said is that every living species comes from the same ancestor. Okay, when you see a bear, no matter how many different types of bear you see, they all come from a common ancestor, a single bear that perhaps began to move and roam into different parts of the globe. And because some bears went north to the North Pole, others went to tropical regions, and so on and so forth, they all pretty much adapted to different climates. They developed different colors, different features, etc., because that's what they needed. They required for adaptation. When the dog, for example, all dogs come from the wolf. That we know. The wolf is the common ancestor of the dogs. But we have so many varieties, of course, because of the climates, because of the environments, that the wolf had to adapt, and it started mutating into the dog. And now we have so many varieties and such and such. So likewise, again, what he's actually saying here is environmental adaptation brings biological change. The environment, when we're trying to adapt to different environments, people mutate, people change, species of animals change, plants change, and so on and so forth. So there's change taking place all the time, in that over time, over the millions and millions of years, all of the species of the past has, according to Darwin, they have simply mutated their forms. When the environment changed, they also changed. So therefore, what he's suggesting here is that the dinosaurs, those gigantic beasts or creatures exhibited in museums, did not die. He believed that they mutated. Okay, they were gigantic back then because there was plenty of food in the environment, plenty. that they survive off. But something happened to the food supply. Something happened. Maybe environmental patterns change. Some catastrophe happened. That food supply decreased significantly in a prolonged way, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, in that those animals had no other choice but to adapt to less and less food. And this process, they began to shrink. And now they're the lizards, the reptiles, the chameleons, the alligators, and so on that we see. Of course, even the birds themselves are the heirs of the dinosaurs. That's his theory, by the way. Okay, so they didn't go anywhere. They simply changed, mutated their form because they were forced to do so under this new environment. All right, so he's going to write that book, a book that is going to turn the world upside down, by the way, 1858. Again, he titled the book The Origins of Species. All of the ideas I just discussed are written there. Okay, and so I'm just going to in this couple of minutes pretty much tell you again the essentials. In other words, what are the ideas in this book that are going to be so significant for turning the world upside down, and of course how people are going to use those ideas in order to understand human beings and human societies and how people need to live. Okay, so what he's actually saying is that evolution is one of the laws of nature. Okay, evolution means that life evolves and has been evolving. That this is one of the laws of nature, in that everything that is alive, okay, is improving, is acquiring a higher and more complex state of existence. He believed that life started with a simple cell millions of years ago, when there was no life on the planet. It started in the water, in the oceans, this lining stroke the ocean, and with the chemicals present, again, we're going to see the birth of a cell. And that cell somehow, began to divide and create, of course, complex organisms. So the simple cell divided into two, and those two cells kind of mated and created other cells that were more complex than the original. And the same mating process of unification and division begins to proceed over and over again. So over the spans of millions of years, we're going to see that those cells begin to form complex organisms like fish from the water, great variety of different fish. And of course, from the fish, some fish stepped out of the water and adapted to the surface of the land and became the reptiles. Okay, the reptiles, the dinosaurs. And they roamed for millions of years, so they mutated. And over time, some of the dinosaurs may come to be, of course, mammals. The wide variety of different mammals, and from the mammals we got, of course, humans. That's his theory. I'm not saying this is set in stone, this is the ultimate truth. I'm just saying this is the theory of evolution. Okay, I'm just presenting the idea in this case. So in general, what the idea suggests is that life is evolving from simple to complex organisms, that we're becoming more and more complex, again, over time. That life in the past was more simple in terms of the organisms, and now it has become more complex. In the future, of course, organisms will become far more complex. Now, this is the heart and soul, of course, of the theory of evolution. Evolution from simple to complex organisms. But another very fundamental idea of the theory is the idea that there's a law, there's a principle of nature guiding evolution. Okay, that nature somehow is guiding the process of evolution, making sure that everything improves. Okay, so what is that principle? He called it natural selection. That nature selects, in other words, the most fit, the most able organisms, the strongest organisms to reproduce. Okay, so the descendants of that organism that is fit, that is strong, that is fit, are going to inherit those traits, and they're going to carry on that particular characteristic of being able to survive, the most survivable, in other words, organisms. Nature are going to select those organisms again to reproduce and pass on and continue the project of upgrading the organisms further into the future. It's called survival of the fittest. So organisms that strive to survive and cannot survive, nature will select those to die off. Okay, and those that are proved to be fit and strong, etc., and survive, and nature will allow those to reproduce. Because nature is somehow interested, of course, in making sure that this process of evolution towards complexity, higher and higher complexity, is ensured. So one way to do it is that, okay, so the weak, the organisms that cannot really adapt and survive, well, they're going to be led to pass on, they pass away. In other words, die, and the survival of the fittest again are going to be the ones that will be able to mate and reproduce and so on and so forth. So again, this is just his theory. Again, it's just a theory that explains how nature works. And maybe in the jungle, maybe that's the case. In other words, well, we might see that in the jungle, and that there's organisms competing with each other. There's prey, there's predators, and of course, the survival of the fittest might be the rule there. In that, again, you have to be very strong and fit to survive in the jungle, if the world of animals, in the animal kingdom, however. So again, there's a struggle for survival. There's a competition for resources amongst animals, and of course, in that competition, of course, the fittest are going to survive, of course. But what happens is that Darwin did not really apply those ideas necessarily to human societies. He was just talking about, how organisms inherit certain traits from ancestors who survived, things like disease and so on and so forth, famine, and they were able to overcome those challenges and make their organisms more survivable and pass on perhaps those traits to their descendants. So he's just talking about, organisms that are fit to survive. And that's pretty much it. But some people, some intellectuals are going to read Darwin and pretty much create their own theory, and in the process apply it to human groups and human societies and nations, believing that humans are not all equal because they're not evolving at the same pace, at the same rhythm, at the same level. In other words, there's some human beings that might be a little bit more evolved than others. Okay? They're not all humans at the same level of evolution. Darwin never said that. Okay? Be very clear. Others are going to misread, misinterpret Darwin and create their own version of Darwin and apply it to sociology, understanding human societies. And that is, of course, the best case of that is, of course, Herbert Spencer. He was a European sociologist who wrote a theory in a book called Social Darwinism. He's the forerunner of what's called Social Darwinism. The ideas of Darwin, of survival of the fittest, and evolution now apply to sociology, and trying to understand again that according to Spencer, that human beings are also can be understood as to be in the process of development, evolutionary development. And in this process of evolutionary development, he said, not all groups, not all people are at the same stage. In other words, that's his idea, by the way. He's applying survival of the fittest in the human kingdom. Okay, the law of the jungle, that is to say that there's also competition between people, between human beings for resources and so on and so forth. And the fittest and the strongest are going to survive. They're going to be dominant, in other words. Okay, like the lion is dominant, of course, in the jungle because he's the strongest and he's the fittest, he's the mightiest, he rules. Well, he said something similar occurs in the world of humans. Again, in that those that are more fit, most able, more intelligent, he said, are going to be dominant, in other words. So for him, again, in his new theory called social Darwinism, he introduced something called social stratification. Okay, social stratification. What is social stratification? That what he said is that it is normal for a society to be stratified, to have ranks, groups that are ranked from low to medium to highest, in other words. Okay, because it is natural that since not all humans are at the same level, not all humans are exactly equally fit, equally strong, equally intelligent. So therefore, Spencer said, it's okay to have, of course, groupings, certain groups located below, others in the middle, and others at the very top to be the dominant ones. A hierarchy of groups, that is to say. This is natural, he said. Again, Spencer is saying that with social Darwinism. So yes, a system of social classes, he said, is natural to have a lower class or working class, middle class, and upper class, because that indicates that evolution is at work. Spencer believed that the upper class, in this case, were the survival of the fittest. They were the most fit, the most able, the strongest, and so on and so forth. So they were dominant. It was their position, their natural standing, in other words, to be dominant because they were survival of the fittest. He also believed that the races, again, of the world, which was an artificial concept. There are no races. There's only one race, and that is the human race. But nonetheless, he looked at certain differences of, bodily structures and colors and characteristics as to be, markers for different races. Again, he also believed that they could be grouped in hierarchical fashions, in that, there were lower, middle, and upper races, and the nations of the world. He said, look, you look nations worldwide, you can also group them in a hierarchy from lower nations to middle to highest. So when the question was asked, so how do you rank them? What will be the yardstick, by which you can say, oh, this group, this social class, or this race or nation is superior or dominant, etc., and should be on top, and this one is in the middle, and this on the bottom. What Spencer said in social Darwinism is that the yardstick to measure the evolutionary development of groups, races, and nations is technology. In other words, how much technology does a group, has developed or has? What kind of technology does a group uses? Okay, is it modern technology? Okay, are we talking about, you have electricity? Do you have, telecommunications like telegraphs, telephones? Do you have things like industry? You have things like railroads, machines? If you have that, that's a sign that you're dominant. In other words, that you have evolved further in the evolutionary scale than the other peoples that are using traditional tools. Okay, so if you're not using modern technology, if you haven't modernized, you need to catch up. You need to evolve. That is to say, you need to evolve further, because you're going to fall behind in development. You're going to fall behind in evolution. You're going to stay behind. So you need to catch up, in other words. So that provided a kind of ideology for nations to feel that, well, we need to catch up, with modernization. We need to modernize. We need to abandon the ways of the past, our traditional tools. People are still using, horses and cattle and ox to plow the land, in a traditional way for farming. Instead of using tractors, we should use modern machinery for farming. Okay, so we should use, irrigation systems, water pumps, electricity to irrigate our fields, because, we don't have that. We are still using rain-making ceremonies. We call upon the rainmaker to bring the rain, and sometimes that fails, sometimes it's not, but it's not very reliable, they said. So we need to catch up with technology. We need to evolve. So again, what Spencer is actually doing is providing a sort of again, his own explanation as to why modernity is necessary, why modernizing is necessary. You need to modernize. You need to have this type of science, okay? Modern science. You need to have this type of technology to show that you are evolving. In other words, you can catch up, you can move upward, but you need to modernize, in other words. And you need capitalism, okay? You need this economic system in order to allow people to improve themselves, to educate themselves so they can evolve and they can acquire a higher status. So what Spencer is going to do by applying the ideas of Darwin in sociology is just trying to provide people of the world with an understanding. This is his own understanding, by the way, that evolution existed and that we need to evolve, we need to achieve a higher order of existence, and that this is the way. The way to do that is modern science, modern technology, and an economic system that will allow people to move upward, that is to say. Okay, so it's very important how Spencer is going to be used, of course, to promote modernization, okay, and all of the other features that we just discussed. So again, this is going to be, of course, a backlash against evolution. Not everybody is going to welcome with open arms the ideas of Darwin, that the world was created millions of years ago by a single cell emerging by its own, and then everything springing from that, of course, from a process of millions and millions of years of evolution. So again, there's going to be, of course, a debate, okay? The debate that is going to question the ideas of Darwin. And this debate, of course, was led primarily by religious, organizations in the United States and also in Europe, of course, are organized to debate Darwin's ideas, to contest Darwin's ideas. And this debate was known as the debate between creation and evolution. Okay, creation and evolution. Religious organizations believe in the story of creation told by the Bible, that there's a God, there's a supreme being, of course, that created the world, created human beings, etc. And it's important for them to actually establish that, because what the religious organizations are indicating is that God indeed created the world and people and gave people certain laws to govern themselves, to be, again, pretty much kind to each other and so on and so forth. That this is not just, again, a godless world in which, again, people are simply competing like animals and it's a survival of the fittest kind of game, the strongest will survive. So again, there was a debate, again, raging on across Europe and in North America between those two camps that is going to pretty much divide, of course, the world between the world of science and religion, and the theory of evolution was the dividing line. In other words, the theory of evolution really came to divide societies, in that either you believed in science and evolution or you believe in religion and creation. That was pretty much how people began to divide themselves as to how do you understand life? How do you understand the world around you, the universe, the purpose of human existence? So creation, of course, looks at religion for inspiration and answers, with a supreme being that guides the lives of people, that cares and so on, and that gives certain norms or behavior. And of course, the evolution, of course, camp just sees that, okay, so there are mechanical, of course, aspects of nature, mechanical laws that are at work, and this is how everything is moving. It's just mechanically, of course, and this is just happening, through a process of nature's natural selection, survival of the fittest. Well, that was a debate back then. So I just want to mention lastly again, the most important, areas of this debate. Why the creationists, as they're called, the people that, again, that really prefer to see the biblical story as to be more consistent with how they see science and how they see the world around them, how they want to explain the origin of life and everything and human existence, is because, number one, the creationists, what they're contesting about the evolutionary theory is that this theory, from their perspective, promotes atheism. Okay? and a godless civilization. In other words, by leaving out the creator and the supreme being from the equation, from the act of creation, from the process of creation, what they're thinking or what they're proposing is that over time, as this theory becomes accepted, then we're going to be moving towards a civilization that is going to abandon all belief in God. In other words, an atheist and godless civilization. Now, of course, there is a lot of debate, even today, whether atheism, is necessarily something that makes people behave in an inappropriate way or not follow certain norms, etc. So I don't want to get into that debate. What I want to actually just refer to is what psychologists and philosophers, etc., have been saying for thousands and thousands of years, and that is, if we indeed, just like the creationists are saying here, indeed abandon all belief in supreme being, of course, and the creator, and abandon all spirituality in the process, of course, that what that will do is that people will feel quite isolated in the world, and that again, we're pretty much isolated. This is just we're living inside of a machine called nature. It has certain mechanical laws, and mechanical laws, like a machine, they're heartless because it's just mechanical. Okay, so again, if we're just inside of this gigantic machine, which is the universe, and it operates independently of what we think or feel. And so again, everything that is going to happen, is going to happen because that's just the mechanics of life. So how do we cope then with the problems of the world? The terrible tragedies that afflict us, for example. The human beings, of course, experience those types of afflictions and calamities and tragedies in this world. So how are we going to cope with that? If there's no connection with the divine, there's no connection with the supreme being, so we don't make sense of anything, so everything is just mechanical operated, in other words, because this is the way nature works. Even the law of evolution has been functioning quite mechanically, and of course with that sense of isolation and disconnection, the people feel disconnected from the world and from other human beings. And the general sense, the general feeling inside of us is one of angst or anguish. Okay, it's constantly in anxiety. Okay, the constant anxiety because just the thought of being isolated and disconnected from the world, it just makes us anxious. Again, there's no meaning, at the end of everything. It's just, again, yeah, nature has its own project. Everything is moving forward in this fashion of evolution, but again, we're going to be pretty much disconnected in the end. And again, there's a sense of anxiety. Of course, the second issue raised in this debate is that if we just buy into just a heartless competition between organisms for survival of the fittest, that if we buy into that as a principle, that will reduce humans to the animal kingdom. In other words, look, animals, of course, behaving that way because they're animals. They prey on each other. They're territorial, and etc. They're competing heartlessly for food and resources, etc. Again, but that's fine. That's the world of an animal. They're guided by instincts, by survival. They're aggressive, etc. That's fine. But are humans gonna be guided by that? Okay, are humans going to be guided by those impulses, by those instincts, or are we supposed to be guided by higher impulses and higher instincts? To be compassionate and so on, to care for one another and so on. Again, so there's also that aspect again, that the debate is not just centered on that, there's the evolution and creation stories, which is one is true, but rather, what is the effect that those ideas are going to have on society, the kind of civilization that we're going to be building in the future. Again, if we're simply reducing everything to competition and survival of the fittest, what kind of world would that be in the future? Okay, so that was another concern, by the way. So at any rate, so in this topic, again, that we just covered, there will be only key terms that you have to pay attention to and study for the exam. Okay, just three key terms. They're all central themes, central key concepts of this topic. And again, those are the three key terms: 19th century scientific and technological revolutions. That's one key term. The other is economic progress through capitalism. That's another key term. You study that separately. And then the third is evolution and social Darwinism, is separately, once again. So it's very simple. Again, you just go back to your notes and say, okay, so there's going to be three key terms that I need to study. When the exam comes at the end of September, there's going to be some key terms there. Those are the specific key terms. So I will ask you to answer one or two, perhaps two, more than likely two, during the exam. And so you need to know very well this material in terms of, okay, so if I'm going to explain the scientific revolution and the technological revolutions, how will I do that? Okay, so he goes back to Isaac Newton in the 1600s, the idea of a mechanical worldview, how to understand the universe, how to go about studying the universe, the scientific method of observations and so on and so forth, the new ideas that are introduced that replace the ideas of the past for understanding the world, the ideas just in the past based on religion. So you give examples, and then you go into technology, for example, the new technologies and so on that came in the 19th century. That's just one example, and so on. So I will provide a segment, a review session, of course, that will be separately done to guide you to answer those questions. But this is the end of this topic. If you have any questions, please email me, and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. Okay, that's all I have for you, and I'll see you then next week. Bye.